Thrilled to have with us. He'll try to bail me out and provide at least some semblance of good content. He's Representative Tom Leek from District 25. He chairs the House Public Integrity and Ethics Committee. And Representative Leek, good to have you on the show. How are you?
Good morning, Preston. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm fascinated to hear the progress that's being made on this front. I mean, anybody that has been reading the news knows that the city of Tallahassee, the state capital, has been under a cloud for the last 5 years. You are specifically looking into the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Tell me what your concerns are there and what they may have done.
You know, in 2012, it was started to be reported that the executive compensation seemed to be out of whack with what you would expect from that particular coalition. And in 2018, it was reported again that it was higher than anybody anticipated. But what we found out when we finally got the documents was just stunning. I mean, shocking to the point that it was hard to put together words on what it all meant. You know, we had heard that the chief executive there was making about $760,000. Now, keep in mind, when she started in this job, she made $75,000. Most of that growth in executive salary came in the last 3 years, and it ballooned to $760,000. She was reporting that. The department asked for the records. The coalition didn't want to give them up. When we finally got the records, what we learned was over the last $3 million, she's made in excess of $7.5 million. $7.5 million, and through some very, very clever mechanisms on how to get it to her. It was shocking.
How in the world does how in the world does an advocacy group that gets the majority of its money from taxpayers operate under that kind of cover that it wasn't recognized sooner?
That's a great question, and I don't think it was not recognized sooner for lack of trying. Remember that the Department of Children and Families had been requesting this information for about 20 months. But here's how they did it. So when you have a salary, you have to report it on a Form 990, right? And you can see that salary. It's with the IRS. You can check it. But what they were doing in this particular instance is they were not paying salary. They were investing significant amounts of money into PTO. So, for instance, the chief executive officer, by the time that she was done, had 210 days of PTO that she could cash in annually. 210 days. The liability on the books at the point of her resignation was about $1.7 million, and I can tell you it had ballooned to over $2 million at different times where she had, but then she took some money out. But that's how they were doing it. They were hiding it because that PTO and the other benefits that go along with it, that PTO doesn't have to be reported publicly.
All right. I've got probably a few thousand people right now driving off of roads. So let's try to help them get back control of their vehicles here. What would you say to those that say 20 months getting records? Why in the world didn't DCF give them 30 days? Why did it take almost 2 years?
You know, I think it's simply because DCF didn't have the control mechanism it needed to. And not that and I mean it was built into the statute. So what the legislature did in 2003 was made the coalition a single source resource force. So the coalition and DCF were forced to contract with each other. All right, so that's how it gets started, and you realize that DCF had no leverage in that contract going forward. Because the coalition was technically a private entity, you know, not the agency as we would tend to suspect it would be. Because it was a private entity, they made lots of legal claims that they shouldn't have to give up that information. It wasn't until the House of Representatives, with its broad subpoena power, said, listen, enough. You're going to give us this information or you're going to give it to us now, that information finally came out. But the House had more subpoena authority power than DCF would have, or the Inspector General more specifically.
11 minutes after the hour, we are with the chairman of the House Public Integrity and Ethics Committee, Representative Tom Leek, District 25. Parts of Volusia County would include Port Orange, New Smyrna Beach, and other areas in the Sunshine State. Representative Leek, what you've just told us is somewhat unbelievable. I'm going to make a comparison to drive home a point, and it's an extreme comparison But, in the wake of 9/11, one of the things that we learned was we just weren't thinking evil enough. We just never considered that people would break in, take over planes, hijack them, and fly them into buildings. Is this somewhat what you're dealing with here? You're uncovering something that you couldn't believe that someone would so take advantage of public dollars and taxpayer money to do this?
It's certainly the latter. It is just difficult to comprehend how it was being done and to the extent it was being done. And I'll give you an example of how the scheme worked. The board members who were approving the executive compensation were also recipients of the funds. And were a select handful of folks that the executive then chose, and it was this kind of incestuous circle of putting these folks onto the board who then turned around and applied for funds from the coalition. So it just, it was so perverted that it just lost the semblance of what it does. Now, I'll tell you, along the way, each of the individual shelters are still doing very good work and still protecting individuals who are victims of domestic violence. But imagine if they had the resources to them that were being diverted to this executive compensation.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there's this wealth of resources that are being denied out of greed. So in essence, they all got a taste of the warden's wife's pie, right?
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
So,
that's a good way to put it.
So now, I mean, I, for one, think it's a no-brainer. If you're receiving public dollars, you are required to disclose, X, Y, and Z. Where are you from a committee standpoint, and is this a slam dunk to get through, get past, get done?
We are still at the beginning of the investigation, so we may find out even more as this goes forward, okay? But this is what we have right now. So we're still in the investigation. That's running down one path. Running down another path is some legislation to remove the coalition as a single source bidder for the state contract. So we're going to give DCF the ability to contract with whomever it liked, and quite frankly, we don't know what happens to the coalition after this going forward. So we will do that, and then looking into the future, we will look to see how the legislation needs to be changed for these other contractors so that we don't have this situation again.
Is there any protection to be had inside your committee from any member of the House, left or right?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, simply put, I mean, is there anybody defending this particular group or these actions? No.
And here's another just crazy aspect of this. There is no one defending them.
Okay, good.
So much so that we started on one day, right? We had the coalition come up. They pledged to give us their full support and cooperation and transparency. They had a lawyer in place. They had an in-house representative in place. They had an outside lobbyist firm in place. They're all marching in the same direction. They're going to be completely transparent and cooperative. In this course of about 12 hours. Oh, and by the way, they told us the board was all resigning and they were going to have all new leadership. In the course of about 12 hours, the lawyer quit, their lobbyist quit, their in-house representative quit, and the board was not quitting.
Let me make
it's just an insane set of circumstances.
Let me make a suggestion to you. I'm one of those guys that thinks that the people that cause these types of situations ought to face the people they're injuring. You ought to have the people that run all those advocacy centers across the state. They ought to get to sit and face those the board members and the director of that coalition. You ought to put them in the same room. Let them explain themselves to them.
I think that's a great idea.
Representative Leek, thanks for what you're doing. Please stay in touch with me. Let me know how this is going.
Thanks, Preston. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you, sir.